developers owned almost everything: the permits, the investors, the politicians. But their billion-dollar mall project stayed completely frozen because one farmer owned a forgotten 40-foot strip nobody cared about for years, until suddenly, everyone wanted it. Nobody understood why he bought the land, not even his own family, 40 feet wide, stuck between dead weeds and broken fencing. But the old farmer bought it anyway. Cold autumn wind moved softly across the county tax auction yard while tired investors flipped carelessly through stacks of unpaid property records beneath buzzing fluorescent lights. Outside, rain tapped slowly against dusty windows as farmers and land brokers argued quietly over farmland parcels, storage lots, and abandoned commercial properties nobody wanted anymore. Near the bottom of one forgotten folder sat Parcel 118C, a narrow 40-foot strip running beside an abandoned service lane outside the city. Most people ignored it immediately. The land looked useless on paper, too narrow for farming, too awkward for development, too small to matter. One realtor laughed openly while reading the map. Who misses tax payments on a ditch? Another investor smirked. That strip ain't worth mowing. But Samuel Turner stayed focused. The 68-year-old farmer sat quietly near the back wall wearing faded denim, overalls darkened by years of work. Beneath the sun, deep wrinkles lined his face, and arthritis stiffened his rough hands. Whenever he unfolded old survey papers beneath the dim lights, still, his eyes missed nothing. Samuel studied the county layout carefully, while others joked nearby. Beyond the abandoned lane rested hundreds of acres of empty, industrial ground stretching toward the highway, interchange outside town. Most people saw weeds and dirt. Samuel saw future expansion, traffic flow, access routes, power. But something else bothered him too. The lane connected directly to the only legally approved emergency entry point for future commercial zoning on the entire East Corridor, and somehow, almost nobody noticed. The auctioneer barely paused before accepting Samuel's bid, $9,000. That was it. People shook their heads while he signed the paperwork quietly beneath flickering lights. Even Samuel's nephew whispered later that night, "Uncle Sam, you just wasted retirement money on garbage land." Samuel only smiled faintly, because deep down, he had a strange feeling the forgotten lane wasn't garbage at all. And 8 years later, an entire billion-dollar project would stop because of it. Then one morning, giant cranes suddenly appeared beside Samuel's forgotten strip of land. At first, Samuel ignored the construction noise. Cities were always building something, always tearing something down. But then the black SUVs started parking beside his lane every morning. The quiet countryside changed almost overnight. Massive steel cranes rose above empty fields like giant skeletons against the gray morning sky, while bulldozers ripped through acres of dirt from sunrise until long after dark. Floodlights illuminated the horizon every night so brightly that Samuel could see them glowing through his farmhouse curtains from nearly 2 miles away. People across the county called it historic, a billion-dollar luxury mall project, high-end stores, restaurants, hotels, a modern shopping empire expected to transform the entire region forever. Television stations celebrated it daily. Politicians smiled beside giant project signs during press conferences. Investors arrived from other states, and suddenly the forgotten East Corridor, Samuel once studied quietly at tax auctions, became the most valuable land in the county. But something felt wrong. Samuel noticed construction, crews constantly stopping near the abandoned service lane beside his 40-foot strip. Engineers argued over maps spread across truck hoods, while legal teams visited repeatedly, carrying folders thick enough to bend beneath their arms. Then one cold afternoon, a polished black SUV stopped directly outside Samuel's farmhouse. A young corporate representative stepped out smiling politely. "We're interested in purchasing your access lane," she explained carefully. "The company is prepared to make a generous offer." Samuel stayed silent, because the woman looked nervous. Too nervous for somebody buying worthless land. "How generous?" he finally asked. She slid forward a printed number, $180,000. Samuel stared quietly at the paper while wind rattled. Loose tin along the barn roof outside. Years earlier, people laughed at him for spending $9,000 on the strip. Now developers offered nearly 20 times that amount immediately, without negotiation, without hesitation. And suddenly, Samuel understood exactly how important the lane truly was. That night he pulled old zoning maps from dusty boxes inside the farmhouse attic, while construction lights flashed endlessly across distant clouds outside. Hours passed quietly beneath dim yellow lamps until, finally, he found what he was searching for: emergency commercial access certification. The billion-dollar mall legally required direct entry through Samuel's forgotten 40-foot lane. Without it, fire permits failed, insurance approvals collapsed, and the entire mall stayed closed. Samuel slowly leaned back in his chair, while silence filled the room, because for the first time in his life, one old farmer held power billionaires desperately needed. The next morning, 3 luxury helicopters landed beside Samuel's farm. The helicopters arrived before sunrise, silver, silent, expensive, and the men stepping out already believed the deal was finished. Morning fog rolled slowly across Samuel Turner's farmland, while 3 luxury helicopters settled beside the abandoned service lane with powerful winds flattening tall grass. Beneath spinning blades, workers from nearby construction zones stopped what they were doing just to watch. Nobody in town had ever seen billionaires land in a farmer's field before. Samuel stood quietly near his fence line, wearing faded work boots covered in mud. Behind him rested old tractors, broken fencing, and weathered barns that hadn't changed much in decades. In front of him stepped men worth more money than most counties would ever see. Expensive suits, gold watches, perfect smiles, but something about them felt cold. The tallest executive introduced himself as Victor Hale, lead investor behind the billion-dollar mall project. His voice sounded calm, practiced, controlled. "We respect intelligent landowners," Victor said while glancing toward the forgotten lane. "And frankly, Mr. Turner, you're standing on extremely valuable property." Samuel didn't answer. Silence made rich men uncomfortable. Inside the farmhouse kitchen, expensive leather folders spread across the old wooden table while coffee steamed quietly between them. Victor finally slid forward the official offer. $2 million. The room fell silent instantly. For 40 feet of forgotten land, most people would have signed immediately without reading a single page. Samuel's nephew certainly would have. Half the county would have celebrated overnight. But something kept bothering Samuel. The investors looked tense, not confident. One younger executive kept checking his watch nervously, while another whispered constantly into his phone near the window. Tiny cracks, tiny signs. Then Samuel asked softly, "What happens if I refuse?" Nobody answered immediately. Victor's smile faded first. "Well," he said carefully, "projects this important tend to move forward one way or another." There it was, not a negotiation, a threat. Samuel leaned back slowly, while old floorboards creaked beneath his chair. His late wife Clara used to warn him about men who smiled while trying to corner people, and now he saw it clearly. They didn't respect him. They expected him to surrender because he was old, rural, and alone. Victor pushed the contract closer. Samuel stared at the papers quietly, then folded them shut. No. The younger executives froze. Outside, distant cranes stood motionless against darkening clouds, because for the first time since construction began, the billion-dollar project had truly stopped moving. That evening, county officials suddenly delivered an emergency legal notice to Samuel's farmhouse. First came the legal letters, then the inspectors. Then suddenly, the entire county started blaming Samuel for everything. The pressure started quietly. A county zoning truck appeared beside Samuel Turner's property before sunrise 3 mornings in a row. Men carrying clipboards photographed fences, drainage ditches, fuel tanks, and old barns that had stood untouched for decades. Days later, violation notices arrived claiming unsafe structures and improper land use needed immediate correction. Samuel understood the message instantly. The billionaires couldn't buy the lane. So now they plan to bury him under pressure instead. Across town, television stations framed the story differently every night. News anchors spoke about lost jobs, frozen investments, and struggling local businesses waiting desperately for the luxury mall to open. Politicians blamed private land complications for the delays. Nobody mentioned the developers. Nobody questioned the corporations. Instead, people blamed the farmer. At diners and gas stations, conversations stopped when Samuel entered. Some neighbors avoided eye contact entirely. Others whispered loudly enough to hear. Selfish old man, trying to squeeze more money, holding the county hostage. Samuel never argued back. But the loneliness hurt more than the threats. Every evening he sat quietly on his porch watching floodlights glow across the unfinished mall project in the distance while construction cranes stood frozen against the dark sky like giant monuments waiting for permission to move again. Then one cold, rainy night, another black SUV arrived. Victor Hale stepped out alone this time, without security, lawyers, or cameras. Rain soaked his expensive coat, while thunder rolled far across the empty fields. "You've made powerful enemies," Victor said softly. Samuel nodded once. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Then Victor finally asked the question nobody expected. "Why did you really buy the lane all those years ago?" Samuel looked toward the highway silently. Because the answer had nothing to do with money. Years earlier, his wife, Clara, discovered county development plans showing future commercial expansion, swallowing dozens of small farms through tax increases and forced buyouts. She warned Samuel that someday wealthy corporations would slowly erase families who worked this land for generations. So he bought the strip, not to become rich, to create a barrier, a delay, a choice. And suddenly, Victor realized something terrifying. Samuel never planned to sell at all. The next morning, bulldozers started moving toward Samuel's lane anyway.
Samuel heard the engines before dawn, heavy, violent, unstoppable. And deep down, he knew the billionaires had finally lost patience. Dense morning fog covered the empty fields while giant bulldozers crawled slowly toward Samuel Turner's 40-foot lane beneath flashing yellow lights. Steel tracks crushed wet gravel with deep mechanical growls that echoed across the countryside like distant thunder. Construction supervisors shouted into radios, while black security trucks lined the roadside beside the unfinished luxury mall project. This wasn't negotiation anymore. This was pressure. Samuel stood quietly near the lane wearing his old brown work coat while cold wind moved through tall grass around his boots. He looked small standing before so much machinery, but strangely, he didn't look afraid. Victor Hale stepped out near the bulldozers, looking exhausted beyond recognition. 11 months of delays had shattered investor confidence. Lawsuits were spreading. Banks demanded answers daily. News helicopters circled overhead every week now, and somebody powerful finally decided waiting was over. "We have emergency county authorization," Victor announced loudly, while holding legal papers against the wind. "Construction resumes today." Workers prepared immediately. Engines roared louder. Bulldozers edged forward slowly, but Samuel never moved. Instead, he calmly removed an older document from inside his coat and handed it toward the county supervisor standing nearby. The man read silently, then his face changed completely, because suddenly everyone realized the truth. The county approval only covered temporary construction access beside the lane, not permanent emergency certification through it. Federal safety laws still required Samuel's 40-foot strip from all evacuation routing. Without it, the entire billion-dollar complex remained legally unusable. The bulldozers stopped instantly. Silence spread across the field. Then something unexpected happened. Pickup trucks appeared along the roadside. Farm trucks, old tractors. One after another, local families started parking beside Samuel's property line. Men who once mocked him stepped out quietly beside women carrying homemade signs. Because during those 11 months, people learned what the mall project truly planned. Property taxes around the corridor would skyrocket after completion. Small farms would disappear within years. Elderly landowners would be forced to sell cheaply once corporate expansion spread outward. Samuel saw it first, and now the county finally understood why he stood alone for so long. Victor looked across the growing crowd with disbelief in his eyes, because the old farmer everyone blamed had become the only thing protecting all of them. Then Samuel finally revealed the one condition that could end the standoff forever.
By sunrise, the entire state was watching. News vans lined the highway. Investors panicked behind closed doors, and one old farmer stood calmly beside 40 feet of dirt that billionaires couldn't control. Cold morning sunlight slowly broke through the clouds above the unfinished luxury mall while television helicopters circled overhead, capturing images of silent bulldozers frozen beside Samuel Turner's narrow lane. Reporters crowded near barricades, speaking urgently into cameras while workers stood helplessly beside idle machines, waiting for orders nobody could give. The billion-dollar project had stopped completely, again. But now the whole country knew why. Samuel stood quietly near the property line wearing the same faded denim jacket he'd owned for years. Around him stretched a wall of local farmers, ranchers, mechanics, and small business owners who once believed he was selfish. Now they understood. The lane was never about greed. It was about survival. Victor Hale approached slowly through the crowd, looking exhausted beyond words. Months of delays had nearly destroyed investor partnerships, triggered lawsuits, and shaken financial markets tied to the project. Yet standing before Samuel now, none of that seemed to matter anymore. "You said you had one condition," Victor asked quietly. Samuel nodded once. Then he handed over a folded document. Victor opened it carefully, and suddenly, the entire crowd fell silent. No demand for millions, no revenge, no impossible payout. Samuel wanted permanent legal protections preventing forced buyouts of nearby family farms, property tax caps for elderly landowners, local ownership guarantees, emergency legal support for small farmers targeted by corporate acquisitions. That was it. Even the reporters stopped talking, because suddenly everybody realized something powerful. The old farmer could have become unbelievably rich. Instead, he used his leverage to protect people weaker than himself. 3 weeks later, developers signed every condition publicly before construction resumed legally. Families kept their land, tax protections passed through county law, and Samuel's 40-foot lane remained untouched beside the massive luxury mall forever. Years later, shoppers driving past the completed project still noticed the narrow strip of untouched dirt cutting beside polished roads and shining buildings. Most never understood why it stayed there, but older farmers always did, because sometimes the smallest piece of land in the world becomes the one thing powerful enough to stop billionaires in their tracks. And somewhere beside the glowing mall lights, 40 forgotten feet of dirt still reminded the world that dignity cannot be bought.